Hi, Alistair.
Hi, Alistair.
How are you doing?
All right. Surviving COVID. Surviving the lockdown.
It's been 17, it's been 20, no, I'm not even going down the route, but it's been, what, 4 years since we had the last discussion?
4 years.
2017, I believe. And
yes.
That's quite a long time, and a lot has happened.
A lot of water under the Connell Bridge since that moment. And you have to really be Scots to get that one.
Yeah.
You have to go to the west of Scotland actually to get that one.
Pretty turbulent waters, I guess, then.
Yeah.
And
well, some turbulent, some quiet, but yes, a lot of turbulent places. So, ask the question.
So we normally ask these two questions every time we start an interview. We just kind of ask a quick summary questions. Should Scotland be an independent country?
Yes.
And how can we achieve that? So
with difficulty.
Yes.
But perhaps a better question is the current thought of how to get it, is it practical? It's all very well to rail and frame and hope and aspire to having a referendum. Are they going to grant a referendum? Is a lawful referendum with a Section 30 ever going to happen?
This is Westminster.
Yes. Well, the problem is let's assume that you can have a referendum, but if only by the simple expedient of having an election, making the election a single issue. They won't stop a Westminster. There's an election coming in 2023. They won't stop the referendum. They won't stop that election, even just because you campaign on one issue alone. And you can do the same for the Scottish Parliament election. But even if you do that and you get the result you want, what's going to make the British government recognise it? They're quite clear. They're quite happy to break international treaties. They're campaigning to get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol as we speak. They were, what was it, limited and something, I can't remember, limited
autocracy?
No. They were going to limited breaches of international law were okay. These guys don't care. These Brexiteers who are running the whole place, they don't care. And the idea that somehow they're going to be good sports about things and grant Nicola or Alec with his supermajority or whomsoever it might be a referendum, it's for the birds. I mean, it's not in anybody's interest to do it. Okay, to go back, why does devolution come about? Why does devolution come to pass? Is it, as some Brexit, some of the unionists like to suggest now, that it was just Tony Blair's couldn't help himself, he playing mischief with the constitution? Well, the answer is no, it didn't. It comes about from the late 60s. You have a situation where from up to about 1964, the way that Scotland votes broadly is in step with the way that Britain votes. Sometimes we don't have a majority of Scottish MPs that mirrors the overall British majority, but generally we have. And what happens is, even when we haven't, those who lose the election are sufficiently large numbers to be prepared to give losers' consent in the expectation that next time around their political views will have the majority and have the power. It's losers' consent. From about 64 onwards, we see the emergence, we break up of the Scottish Unionist Party into the SNP. Many of them join the SNP, hence the name of the Tartan Tories. Some go on to become real right of centre advocates, or paladins of Thatcherism, as it turns out later on, and form the Scottish Conservative Unionist Association, which is really just a part of the English party. And this creates a body of people, about roughly 20% of the people, who have no vested interest in the system and have no losers' consent, none at all. Because their views are not going to be represented, even if the next political party is the Conservatives or the Labour Party, whoever you want to say, they're not going to have their views represented. And devolution comes about simply to give these people a vested interest in the system, to ensure that they have losers' consent in the system. And it happens at a time of growing civil unrest across the world. You have the civil rights demonstrations in America. You have increasing dissent in Quebec. You have the civil rights in Ireland. You have civil disturbances across France, leading to the Grosvenor Square riots in London over Vietnam. You have the civil rights demonstrations in Ireland. You have the civil right, the riots in '68 in Chicago and various other places in America.
The rise of terrorist organisations.
And out of this comes
ETA, the IRA, Road Army faction,
FLQ in Quebec.
Yes.
The various, and principally the provisional IRA. And devolution is granted not because of some whim on anybody on the part of the unions. They didn't take a carving knife to the Constitution simply out of a whim. They did it because there was a serious threat to the state. It's as simple as that. They perceived a growing threat to the state. They could head it off in Scotland, but they couldn't head it off in Ireland. So they grant devolution, or they propose devolution. First the Co-Brandon Commission, the Conservatives set that up, and it goes into play throughout. The Conservatives don't do anything in the 70 to 74 election, but Labour come in and they bring it in. Who are the principal opponents of devolution? The answer is the Labour Party MPs. Why? Because they know that if truly you give the SNP or the voters a meaningful stake in the union, albeit a devolved union, sooner or later the Labour Party MPs in Scotland are going to suffer. Now they may be sort of prehistoric grazers in many cases, intellectually challenged at best, but they're not too stupid to see where their interests lie. And they know perfectly well.
Yeah, we're not too clever to be actually. We don't think that way, according to one certain Labour
that's another one,
MSP. Yes. We're not genetically organised.
Not genetically. Well, they're definitely not genetically capable of things. But they're cunning enough to see that their interests lie. So they do their best to nobble it, which they succeed in '79. But the hare has been set running, and who buys into? Not initially, but who buys into devolution? To make devolution a success, who has to buy into devolution?
Well, probably all the opposition parties.
It begins with S and ends with P.
Okay.
Dure's main purpose in all of this constitutional convention stuff is to rope the SNP into independent, into devolution, because it doesn't work. If they don't get the meaning, if they don't join in and the support, and their voters don't get a sense of losers' consent, the whole thing's a ball of chalk in the first place. But if they do, then they, as it were, they house train the SNP, for want of a better expression. And the SNP have been house trained. There's no question of that. They are committed to the union system. Now they may tell themselves, and I don't say without truth and honesty, they may tell themselves that they are doing this to promote independence, and I'm prepared to believe it, because the SNP's relationship with independence is a bit like the Jewish prayer at Passover. Next year in Jerusalem.
Next year in Edinburgh. Okay.
No. Next year independence.
Oh,
but
okay.
Of all the people who utter the prayer, the Jewish people who utter the prayer at Passover, how many really plan to go to Jerusalem? Far less plan to go next year. Very few. So is the prayer meaningless? No, it's not. The prayer is replete with meaning. It speaks to who they are, how they see the world, their values, all sorts of things. It's a true prayer because it speaks to the view of the world. But it doesn't mean what it says on the tin. It doesn't mean that they're going to Jerusalem next year. And much the same with the SNP and independence. They believe it. They truly believe it. It's a main force. It speaks to who they are and how they see the world. But it doesn't mean they're going to plan and achieve independence and take steps to achieve independence this year, next year, or sometime or other. For SNP, independence is they like it in a sweet spot, which is in sight but out of reach. Because that way you can campaign on it, you can keep the activist happy, it's something they can talk about, but allows them to get on with devolution. Because remember, going back to it, they bought into devolution big time in the 80s. It's how they get it. And I don't mean, one could be harsh and say that, You mean it for some people it pays mortgages and puts cars in garages. Yes, it does, but that's not really it. For somebody like Nicola or a man along the road, it gives them purpose. They do something. They can enact laws. They can do things. There's a purpose to their political lives, as opposed to sitting in the background carping about independence forever and a day. You can see the attractions. You can see the prospect of really trying to do something. And whether it's baby boxes or tuition fees, they achieve something. Not necessarily an awful lot, but they do achieve something. And that's why devolution has become, for want of a better expression, the true love of independence. Or true love of the SNP, not independence, sorry. But as our friend Oscar Wilde says,
We're not open, mate. No, you're fine. I'll close the door. Thank you. Oh, it's a lovely day. It's great.
As our friend Oscar Wilde says,
okay, that's fine then.
As our friend Oscar Wilde says, it's the love that dare not speak its name. It's true.
But he wasn't referring to politics.
No, he wasn't. But Oscar was never short of good quotes.
No, he wasn't. No, he was quite good. No.
Somebody says, I wish I'd said that, Oscar. He said, you will, my dear, you will. But Oscar was right. It's the love that dare not speak its name. That's what the SNP are really about. Is that harsh? Yes. Will it offend people? Of course it will. But ultimately, if you want independence, you're going to have to face a few uncomfortable thoughts, uncomfortable truths, and you're going to have to buckle down and do the right thing. You know, it would be wonderful if we could leave home and mum still comes round and does the washing, puts food in the fridge, etc. But that's not what leaving home's really like. There are some uncomfortable things. If you want the privilege of not answering to mum and dad in the mornings of where you've been last night and all that stuff, then you got to take the downsides as well. And the SNP cannot and will not give up the benefits of devolution just for independence.
So do you think people have got that has actually been created, that there's this confusion between devolution and independence, and to get the debate clarified we have to split them apart and to understand what each one actually is?
You have to understand what devolution is and what it does and what it was intended to do right from the beginning. Because if you believe, as the SNP have sold themselves on, that it's a route to independence, well, put aside the fact that it may or may not be the case in the 1980s, it is not the case now. They're putting it into reverse. So it's a self-deluding falsehood to say that there's a prospect of, show a bit more good governance. Again, show the good governance argument. We perhaps will go into more what devolution is really like later, but you cannot govern well through devolution. It's not possible. You don't have the agency to do it.
The agency is a key word here. You're going to have to kind of extrapolate on that a little bit.
Okay, well, an example.
Yeah.
Nicola has the power during the COVID crisis under public health legislation and the COVID legislation to shut the border, as has Mark Drayford. Drayford actually tries. He's the Welsh First Minister. He tries. He seeks permission from law. He seeks London's cooperation by extending the provisions of the furlough scheme, to which London says, on your way, son. No. Only when England has to go into lockdown a couple of weeks later do they extend the financial provisions and thus allow Scotland and Wales to do that. That's an example where they have the power. They have the power and the control of the issue, the power to change things, but they don't have the agency to do it because they don't have the money. They don't have the financial wherewithal to do what they want. So devolution is a bit like an extending lead, an extending dog's lead. It allows the dog to run around, but ultimately it must eventually go the way that the person holding the lead goes, and that is London. So thus it is. And so that's in a sense what it means. But devolution is designed it's the worst of all worlds. It's designed to give Scotland control of issues, the power to change things, but no real agency to do so. Let us say, for the sake of argument, we say, well, look, we've got the 17th, 20th, I think it's 20th now, best health service in the world. Let's change it. Can't. We're so intimately joined to the English health service in so many different ways. Methods of funding, how do we fund it? If we want to change, how do we fund it? How do we fund the change? So we can maybe run the health service a little bit better, maybe a little bit worse, depending on how you want to see. But the margin of change from that they do in England is very limited, because we cannot turn around and say we will finance it differently. We don't have control of national insurance. And yet now what the English are saying is they're going to put up national insurance to pay for English healthcare. So in effect we're going to be paying for English healthcare. Oh, so not home care, not healthcare, sorry. Social home care. Devolution is the worst of all worlds, and it's, you have to, before you can step forward in independence to promote independence, you have to recognise that fact. But once you do, it's a liberating moment, because once you've liberated from the so-called features and so-called benefits of devolution, you find yourself able to contemplate rational and reasonable policies for independence. A border, for instance. Well, borders are part and parcel of being a grown-up country. Yeah. But devolution provides no border. So all this stuff about foreigners and making foreigners of our families, they're not any more than if my family moved to, I mean, I've got family in Thailand. They're not foreigners because they're a different country with a different border. That's nonsense. It's patent nonsense. But nobody can challenge it. Nobody challenges. Nobody in Scotland, none of the SNP challenges this because they're so wedded to devolution.
So how do we shift the debate? How do we get it to, if you do get them compartmentalised quite clearly and understand the SNP are stuck within the framework of devolution, how do we get them to shift that debate onto true independence? And what that actually, and how do we do that? What is independence going to look like, and how is that going to be achieved?
Because you point out the failings of the current system.
We've done that ad nauseum.
No, we haven't.
Really?
No, we've never failed. Who has ever pointed out the failings of how we say we run the NHS a bit better, but nobody says let's run it differently.
Well, the FERA are doing some exposing work recently, which I think is needed and valued. Especially when you peel back the layers and look at actually what's taking place and the mechanics of certain of the Scottish government's policies, one of them being power, energy, green, the whole green agenda. They're actually sitting down and saying, okay, we're hearing, we can hear the kind of the rhetoric on this, but what's actually really happening?
Well, very little.
Yeah.
But there's a reason why there's very little happening, because they don't have the agency to do it. It all comes back to this. You see, if you go back to the old Scottish office, you had at that time, before devolution, you had a pocket Prime Minister, the Scottish Secretary. You had a pocket government, that is the Scottish Office Ministers. And you had a pocket Parliament, that is the Scottish Grand Committee. Okay? But these are all working within the Westminster government. So when the Scottish office, the Scottish Prime Minister, pocket Prime Minister, decides that he wants to do X or Y or Z, he is part of the government that has the control, and therefore can seek the power or the agency, not only the power but also the finance, the means, the commitment to get it done. If he can pass it through Cabinet in London, he gets it done. But all of that swept away in 97. And we get this Parliament that has power, and ostensibly power to act independently, but not the capacity to actually do it. They don't have the money. So let's say, for the sake of argument, we say, right, we're going to change how the health service funded. We believe that the health service should have 20% more funding, for argument's sake. We can't change the method by which it is currently financed, what can we do? Well, we've got a few tax powers, but that's not really going to help very much, because we are not taxing necessarily effectively or fairly, or building in a future provision. One of the big problems with the welfare state in the UK is that we don't have a pot of cash dedicated to it. It's not, we the current generation are funding the previous generation in the hope that the next generation will fund us, and so on. And that comes about for all sorts of reasons, good or bad. We can't, and it's not a desirable situation, but there's nothing we can do to change it. No matter what you think the new system should be like, no matter what your plans for it, no matter what your ideas for it, you cannot change it, because you don't have control of the levers that could bring about a change. Right? And there's not going to happen under devolution. Even if you get a few more bits of devolution, devolution is now going into reverse. They're now, in a sense, they're recreating the old system, because they're using this thing that the English like to call approved autonomy. So you as a council, let's say Argyll and Bute Council, can go to London through your MP, but realistically only if he's a Tory MP. So you would find the nearest Tory MP, I don't know if there is, in a constituency adjoining this country, and say, we want to do something different. We want to do X, Y and Z, build a flagpole in every street. And if they say, yes, we agree with that, they'll make the funds available. They'll in fact give the council the agency that they deny, that devolution denies the government in Scotland. But more importantly, you will quickly find a situation arising where the only practical way to deviate from the current norm is to go to London and not to Edinburgh, because Edinburgh doesn't have the agency power. So there's a lot of talk about, well, they're going to abolish the Parliament. They don't need to. They're implementing a system which is a radical change of devolution. Now that's arguably a good thing, because it will probably result in a better system than devolution, but it won't be devolution as we understand it up till then, 2021.
Could we then use that to our own advantage? If they are wishing to change the guideline or the precepts of devolution, can we then use that as a point to shift the debate to independence and to make clear what the follow through on devolution is? If you continue on devolution as it stands, or if it gets removed, which is something we've discussed since 2017, was a topic of conversation in here, of the fact that they are going to withdraw powers from Edinburgh, and if that begins to happen, there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction. Can we then just say, look, that's an old debate? Can we now shift the debate onto a true independence policy here?
Yeah, because if you turn around, if you rip up devolution in your mind and say,
yes,
we're independence means we're not constrained by devolution. Good or bad, devolution is swept away. I mean, the independence, the SNP keep saying independence will protect devolution, but it's not. Independence must sweep devolution away by definition.
Yeah.
So that's their mindset. They can't get past this mindset. But what we have to do is move the debate onto discussing what an independent Scotland looks like in practical terms, but freed from the boundaries of devolution.
Some of us have tried that.
No.
Well, in discussions and debates. I mean, I've had this debate with some folks anyway. But when we were discussing this, I said to this individual, I said, look, what we need is a constitution. We need a fully formed, fully fledged, fully kind of complete, at least a basic constitution to bring forward. Because if we are moving towards independence, the only way we will be recognised internationally is if we have bona fides constitution. Without a constitution, no one will recognise us.
Okay, but why not go back and think about the stuff that the unionists are going to disagree with?
Well, that's just where do you start?
Well, Quite simple.
Currency.
Debt,
Debt, yes.
Currency,
Yeah.
etc.
Banking, yeah.
Economic growth. Whether you come from this from a left or a right of centre point of view, if you start from a position that Scotland's current constitutional settlement is failing it, which it is, and there's not much doubt in that.
Right.
Right. I mean, what happens in the 80s is that there's a change away from state finance to promote growth. Thatcher promotes private finance to do so. Now, this is not new. I mean, the Railway Acts of the 19th century bring private money into developing the infrastructure of the country. So this is not a radical thing. It's not even Thatcher. It's perfectly okay. What happens, however, is that you find a situation arising where to get finance behind a project, you have to both put the statute book behind it. The government has to put the statute book. So you have to have the Railway Act. But of course, people aren't stupid. They know that governments change. Investors, people with money aren't stupid. They know that governments change and the people change their mind, and that's all right, fine. So the investors require that you put both your legislative, your statute book, and your balance sheet behind it. Now, that doesn't have to mean that the government pays the bills or gets it doesn't have to provide the money. But let's say we pass the Railway Act this year and the next government comes in and reneges on it and repeals the legislation. Because in the contracts there's a clause which says that the government will pay off the losses if they change their mind. That's the extent to putting both the statute book and the balance sheet behind it, so that the government, you hold them, because governments change their mind, people change their mind, governments change their mind, so you're holding them, you're keeping them honest, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Now,
we have got in Scotland, a very limited capacity to put the balance sheet behind it. We have a limit per annum of 450 million. That's all we can put behind it per annum, without permission from London, approved autonomy, and a hard ceiling of 3.5 billion. In infrastructure terms, it's a refurbished shopping centre. It's a refurbished high street here and there. It's nothing, absolutely nothing. Singapore spends a quarter of its GDP on infrastructure. Now, they've got double the GDP we've got, give or take, but we're not spending 12.5% of our GDP anything close to infrastructure.
No.
And it's not because we don't have that 12.5%, it's because somebody else is making the decisions for it. Who's making the decisions? Well, Boris in London, not Nicola in Edinburgh. That's who makes the decisions. And it's that lack of agency, it's that devolution builds us in. We've got the power to build, we've got all the powers in the world to build huge bridges and repopulate the highlands, pave the rainforest if you want. You can plumb it in the highlands, but you don't have the money, you don't have the means to do it. Now, if you start to conceive the problems of Scotland in terms of once you've been liberated from the constraints of devolution, all of a sudden, making the case for independence becomes simple, obvious. Yeah. Well, why would you live in a crappy housing estate with no services. You've got shitty broadband. You've got all this thing, and you've got a government in Edinburgh who you vote to make changes, but who in practice cannot make any changes to your life, or can only make minuscule changes to your life. And the people who can make the changes you didn't vote for in London and don't give a stuff about you.
Isn't this precisely the reason why there was such an upsurge in voter registration in 2014 for the independence, for the IndyRef? And because they thought, okay, finally we'll get our own state and we'll be able to do it, maybe we'll move ahead. But that and then that was transferred in 2015 to giving all the MPs on 56 MPs in London, with the assumption, I guess, it wasn't what was written on the ballot box, but it was the assumption of if you've got so many MPs in London, we can do this. But then post that 2014-2015 era, that groundswell of public support has receded way back. How do you, if they...
Nobody has made the case for independence since the 19th of September 2014.
What about all those Section 30 orders that were trying to achieve down in London?
That's not making a case for independence.
Oh dear me.
That's making a case for a referendum that you know you're not going to get.
So who? I mean, I don't even think Alba has made that case either.
Nobody has, because with the greatest of respect to I mean, we can throw rotten eggs and pies at Nicola, but the truth of the matter is neither the Greens nor Alaba or anybody else has any more idea how to get a referendum than Nicola has.
Yeah.
You're asking her to do
something the state is not going to agree to.
Well, that's right. And ultimately, how did they clear the Augean stables?
How did they clear the what?
The Augean stables.
The Augean stables? What are the Augean stables?
Well, it's a stable full of
horseshit.
Yes. And Hercules is one of his labours.
I thought we were going to get Alexander to kind of cut through the Gordian knot. No, we're on here.
Hercules, in his labours, is required to clean the Augean stables and handed a shovel for the task, which of course is an insurmountable task, because just as much as you clean them out, the horses are there pooping away quite happily, and thus it is an impossible task. But Hercules, up to the minute, he diverts the local river through the stables and washes them out. And in a sense, that's kind of what you have to do. You have to wash out all the thinking of devolution. If you are wedded to in fairness to the SNP, they've got an intractable task.
Yes.
How do you make a case for independence that preserves all of the features and so-called benefits of devolution?
And
it's not impossible.
They don't agree with each other. Independence and devolution are two completely different ideas.
Yeah, they're not going to do it. There's no prospect of them doing it. They're not going to do it, and they're not even attempting it. There's no secret committee. There's no hidden agenda. There's nothing. And the reason is because it's an intractable problem. You cannot solve it. Not like that, anyway. You have to do something like, as you say, the Gordian knot has to be severed. It's not unpicked and untied. It's severed with a sword. And that's the key. The point is, you cannot craft a debate for independence. You cannot craft an argument for independence that preserves devolution. You have to sweep away devolution. And that is terribly difficult, and it may be impossible for the SNP, but you have to. There's no prospect of independence. There's no prospect of independence through simply going and knocking on the door and saying, "Please, Boris, be a good sport and grant a Section 30." So
for those of us that are seeking an independent Scotland, and we've been kind of knocking at this door for years now, how do we go about shifting that focus of the debate away from devolution and truly focusing on independence? How do we do that? How do we actually get them to turn around and say, when they have that discussion up in the High Hegians office, say, no, that's a devolutionary idea, not stop that, let's get back on track here and focus on independence?
It's not easy. I mean, the reality is that the SNP starts off life out of two parties, an amalgam of two parties. Yeah. There's the Scottish Party, who are sort of right of centre. They're really the Cathcart Unionist Association that have fallen in love with the idea of emergent nations preserving their culture out of the President Wilson's 18 points and all that sort of stuff at the end of the First World War. And there's the National Party of Scotland, who emerge out of the Labour Party when the Labour Party abandons Home Rule as a prospect. But they have two separate views. Well, in those days they called it self-government, which meant being a dominion.
Yes.
And the other one was Home Rule. After the war, that becomes independence and devolution. But for the moment, we'll stick with it. Now, the problem is that although the National Party of Scotland provide most of the members for the new SNP, most of the political savvy comes from the experienced members of the Cathcart Unionists, or the Scottish Party. So the SNP quickly becomes a self-governance party. And the guy who, although he was never a chairman of the SNP or president of the SNP or anything, or leader, the guy who brings them together and the guy who's the de facto leader is John McCormick. There somewhere. And John's a devolutionist, a home ruler, heart and soul. He eventually leaves the party in 1942, at the height of the Second World War, never to return. The party splits over independence or devolution. And thus it proceeds apace, fighting forevermore, it seems, on is it independence or home rule, but independence mostly winning. But by this stage of the game, by the early 50s, the SNP conference would barely fill the steps of Dunedin Hall. And I mean everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen pictures of SNP conferences in the 50s with less than a dozen people there, all bedecked in kilts usually, and feather bonnets and all sorts of stuff. But when the empire starts to fall apart, and the economic justification for union, which is the exploitation of empire by the middle class in Scotland, they start to abandon the union, and that's why they then drift into the SNP, and that's what changes things. But that brings back the same fight that MacDonald, the McCormick had. Is it devolution or independence? Which is it to be? And this fight embitters everybody, such that the irony of it is that the SNP won't campaign for devolution in '79. The SNP took a step back they wouldn't campaign because they are committed at this stage to independence, and they have virtually nothing to do with the 2014 referendum until the last 6 months, because it's about independence and they're in favour now of devolution. It's the ultimate irony. The only time that they succeed is when the SNP are committed. It's a devolution referendum and they're committed to devolution, and then the referendum succeeds. But you have a situation where the man who comes along and severs the Gordian knot of this is your man McCormick, another McCormick, Junior McCormick, the second son of our friend John. And he comes up and he says, no, and it's a simple insight. It's a simple insight. And that he says that devolution is not the spawn of the devil, nor is independence pie in the sky. The first, progressively, it's a ratchet, it's a one-way street, and the more you get of the first, the nearer you get to the second, and thus it is devolution is the mechanism by which we achieve independence. They're not contradictory, says McCormick. Now, it's a brilliant insight by a brilliant man, and with that he brings the SNP together. They're no longer, some can't accept it and they leave, but most accept it, most go along with it, and they never look back. They become committed to devolution, and they never ever look back. It has, for all its contradictions, and even when circumstances change, when they start to repair it, they're still committed. They still are committed. And that is, in a sense, the thing you have to point out. There is no progression from devolution to independence. Everyone who's sitting back saying, yeah, we'll get a referendum, knowing that they're not going to do so, tells themselves it's okay to do that, because devolution will get us there. Show good governance. Show people in Scotland we can govern properly. Well, you've been at it for 14 years now, and if you haven't shown them so far, you haven't shown them anything. Bottom line. But even if you can, because of the limitations, you're never going to get to the point where you can substantially change society. Indeed, all you really
have
do...
full agency to do so.
Pardon?
And have full agency to do so.
Yeah, you can't. But ironically, you actually get to find it the other side, because the unionists forever charge, well, you're not even making use of the powers you've got.
Yes.
And to be fair, it's a fair charge.
And that was it Kit Malthouse in the 50th anniversary of Missouri Drugs Act? That's exactly what he said.
Yeah.
You've got the powers, on you go.
Yeah, but you don't really have the powers.
But we don't, no.
You have the powers, you have the control, and you have the powers.
But no agency.
It all comes down to agency. And the minute you start to frame devolution in terms of agency rather than in terms of powers, then that is the moment where the scales from your eyes and you say, yeah, okay, I get it now. So you, in the next one of these, discussing devolution and how devolution constrains Scotland. I mean, one of the effects of devolution but the removal of agency, because what happens when the Conservatives take power in the 80s, they are partisan in the extreme. The formal commitment of money to the economy is rolled back, and it comes quite informally through MPs' interventions. And the truth of the matter is that Scotland didn't elect MPs. It didn't elect Conservative MPs. So they, as a matter of natural, I mean, you can't blame them for it, but you can't expect different from them. They are venal people, and they commit the money to the places that elect them. I mean, it's not a new thing. Pork barrel is not a new thing, but Scotland really loses out. So Scotland ends up in a situation where we have a situation where our industries have emerged from the post-industrial revolution, with Thatcher's devastation of all those previous heavy industries, with almost no requirement for government intervention. Well, our industries don't require government intervention, and mostly they are in goods and services which have an inelastic demand. Means that the demand is very stable. Now that has two effects. The first one is that at the moment we're saying, well, the Scottish economy is growing better than the English one. Well, that's right, but that's what happens every time we have a recession. We go through the bad bit of the recession much better than the English do, because our demand is stable. But when it comes to expansion, they expand much further than we do and grow much faster than we do, because we've got a very stable demand for our products and services. Now, the good thing about that is that come independence, the chances of our trade collapsing in the way that a lot of England's trade has collapsed due to Brexit are negligible, because we have a very stable demand for our products and services. A good example, I was driving through Glasgow a couple of years ago, and somebody with this report came on the radio about Scotland's space industry in Glasgow. I had no idea that we had a space industry in Glasgow. I mean, I'm gobsmacked with this. What?
Yes.
And I looked it up, and lo and behold, we have a huge space industry in Glasgow. But we produce microsatellites, so they're that size. Now, if you want a microsatellite, there's nowhere else in the world you go. You go to Glasgow. You go to the firms in and around Glasgow, and they provide you a microsatellite. But if you want a big satellite, you go somewhere else. But if you want these microsatellites, they're about 6 inches square, no more. And there are dozens of them are packed into one of the Soyuz rockets and sent north, or sent skyward, or spaceward, as the case may be. But that's not going to change. Whiskey is not going to change. People you impose a border in England, with England, people are still going to drink whiskey. They're still going to eat, to the extent that they do, lochfine salmon or whatever it is, because we don't have industries that are dependent, the growth of which is dependent on government intervention. Now that's a good thing that's happened out of it, because, it's a good thing from an independence point of view, because it means it's very difficult, it's very easy for us to weather the storm of independence in a way that England is going to suffer during Brexit.
I think, in that regard, I think we've really got to shore up our own internal markets quite a bit. Our reliance on the EU, and in terms of fish, in terms of lambing, in terms of some of the farming sources that are coming in, we're really going to have to shift the perspective of farming in Scotland. There's a move right now through in Edinburgh. They're getting there, but Scotland really needs to get into a form of regenerative agriculture. That's not yet, doesn't exist yet, and it's more focused on localised production and localised markets.
Okay, now
that's going to have to happen.
No, that's a fair point. That's a good one. What agency do we have the powers to do that in Scotland? We've got control of agriculture. in
The
Scotland.
only well, I think we.
What is it? What is it you're suggesting we do that the Scottish government doesn't have the power to do?
Actually, the Scottish government does have the power to do this.
Aye, there you go.
However, it doesn't want to do it.
But even if it did want to do it, could it do it?
Yes,
How?
actually,
How? Where would the funding come from?
the funding is it's not really a shift in funding. It's a shift in marketing that has to take place. Rather than going international, we go internal.
But how would we market internationally?
We're ready. That's already that boat's already gone. That was how you said they were making their money.
I'm coming back to where's the agency for us to change this? We have the power to change it, but if we wish to change the nature of farming in Scotland, first of all, we're going to have to change regulations. By definition.
Yeah.
Now, if we change the regulations, will our new products, newly produced products, new method produced products, will they be acceptable in the English market?
It would well, this is again one of the discussions we're actually having. For instance, for one particular market I was looking at, we would actually have to do thorough research to make sure that there's actually a market for these products to be produced for.
No, but let's assume, yes or no. But let's say we want to produce ram in Scotland by a different method, right? Whatever it is.
Right. Okay.
It has to be checked before it goes to table and all sorts of things like this. We slaughter regulations. Have we got the means to change these regulations and make those regulations applicable in our biggest markets?
No.
Because we lack.
No, it's not even agency.
It is.
Well, if they won't accept our produce in that secondary market, you know, there's no way on earth we can actually change that if they don't want to accept the product.
No, but we are bound into a broader economy.
Yes.
And our customers are not going to simply be in Scotland. So on that basis, how do you do that? Would we lack agency to do it in independence? Quite possibly, from what you're saying. The point is that devolution doesn't give us any better situation.
Yes.
We can't say, well, at least we can sell it in England. No, we can't. But let us put it a different way around. Let us say that England decided to make those changes and we didn't like it, or let's say they make changes that we don't like. Let's say they say, well, look, all this nonsense about having meat checked at the abattoir, let's get rid of that. Let's sell it you like. This nonsense about not putting putting acid and alkali in the milk when it goes bad, that's silly. And let the buyer beware. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Can the English force their products onto our market? Yes, they can. Because they control the internal market. They've taken...
yes.
No, they've taken control of it just recently. The internal markets bill is what they've done.
That's right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
They've taken control of the market. So the English can form that. The London in London can force it upon us, but we cannot make similar sorts of changes, for good or for ill, and force them on the rest of the UK. Nor can we say, look, you guys poison yourself how you like, but you're not selling it up here. No. England said, no, we want to sell it up there, we sell it up there. You control agriculture, you control food standards, but we say what happens. Everything about devolution comes down to one thing: the agency to achieve things. And we don't have it. And if you start looking at independence in that concept, somebody once put it, take back control. But that's essentially what you're doing. You're taking back control of what happens. There's no and once you expose it, once you start to look at devolution and say, hang on a second, how could we do what we want to do?
We'd have to view devolution as a trap.
It is a trap. But
so how do we shift that? So you see that.
But well, here's the beauty: if you without and this is the beauty of it. Once you get to that point, once you start making the case in terms of independence, in terms of agency, not only do you make a convincing argument, you have to trash some bits of devolution. You have to accept that. You can't have all of the features of devolution. You have to put some of that to one side and say, well, no, that won't happen. But once you start crafting the argument in terms of agency, there's an added but perhaps unseen bonus, and that is you make the unionists argue for a lack of agency.
Okay.
You put them on the back foot.
Yeah.
You make them argue for a system that doesn't work. You make them argue for no, you remain powerless. Once you cast it in terms of agency, once you see devolution through the prism of agency, it becomes difficult to justify any of it. I mean, once you start, there are pockets here and there they can do it. They managed to achieve they managed to achieve tuition fees as a significant departure from England. But there are few circumstances in which that can happen. It's not entirely defunct, but it's largely so. I mean, there are very little things. They can do things like the Road Traffic Act, the road equivalent tariff. They can do things like the baby box that the English don't cover. They could even do the smoking ban a bit earlier. But these are trivial stuff by comparison to the sorts of deprivation and difficulties and the lack of economic growth and the poor infrastructure that Scotland has. And there's no future that's going to be better. I mean, I don't know if you've looked through the new funding that is going to replace, but it's a joke. It's washers. I mean, Scotland will be getting 400. They're committing 800 million to the devolved regions, which Scotland gets just north of 400 million. That's over a 5-year period. That's our structural funding. That's the replacement for the EU structural funding in the Levelling Up Fund. I think it is the Co-Prosperity Levelling Up Fund, whatever. Now 400 million divided by 32, divide by 5, divide by 32, takes you down to sort of 6 or 7 million. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But that's a new town hall. This is not going to. I mean, they keep talking about this. Suddenly, it's going to union badges and bridges and things, but you're not going to be any bridges. It's not badges and bridges. It's badges and buckets full of flowers. That's all it is. Because there's nothing there. The money's just not coming through. Now, what can we do to change that? What do you? I mean, you're faced with a situation. You can either continue to fail. It's like a dysfunctional marriage. There comes a moment where you just have to say, look, whatever I thought of her, whatever promises she makes, she's not going to stop drinking, shagging around, whatever it might be that she's doing, and vice versa. I mean, there's not. I'm sure women say the other way around, but ultimately, it's a failed system. And once you start looking at it just in terms of agency, once you start looking at bits of devolution or the arguments for independence in terms of the agency, what you can do with it. See, one of the ironies of the Brexit referendum is that they couldn't make the agency argument because Britain largely had the agency. We can make the agency argument. They weren't really taking back control because they already had control. Yeah. The slogan is valid for us because we are actually taking back control. And when people say, well, you're just going to give it back to the EU, they say, well, yeah, but you have far greater levels of control. We're not going to be North Korea, of course we're not. Anyway, we probably talked too long.
Okay, 55 minutes.
Yeah, that's too long.
It's a long.
I wasn't really thinking that today would be of something that we should keep it to 20 minutes.
Sure, sounds good.
But from that we can then work out what the questions should be to get to that point, and what the ultimate point should be, and it should have a roundup on it as well.
Sure. Okay, well, we'll do that in the next one then. Thanks for your time, Alistair.